Have you ever had the feeling that the universe was trying to speak to you through the smallest things, the sound of the wind, the flicker of a flame, the way a shadow moves across the floor? This is the story of Sophia, a quiet woman whose sadness was so deep that even the light in her room seemed to weep with her. Maybe you've never seen your pain reflected in a flickering bulb, but perhaps you felt unseen, unheard, like your sorrow was too invisible for the world to notice. So today I invite you to step into Sophia's shoes, and maybe in her story I'll find pieces of your own. Sophia lived alone in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an aging building. The walls were thin, the nights were long, and silence had become her most familiar companion. She worked at a bookstore downtown, spent her evenings reading in bed, and rarely spoke more than a few words a day. She had friends, once a family, that called, but everything faded slowly until even her voice began to disappear into herself. But there was one thing that kept catching her attention: the light in her bedroom ceiling. Not the kind that hums or flickers because of faulty wiring. This was different. This light blinked only when her heart did, only when her tears stayed too long behind her eyes. It started one night after she came home from a long day and sat on the edge of her bed staring at the floor. She felt it again, that hollow ache in her chest, like something was missing. But she didn't know what. As her thoughts spiraled, her breath grew shallow and the sadness took its usual seat beside her. Suddenly the light above her flickered once sharp, then again slower, as if reacting to the heaviness in the room. She looked up startled. There was no storm outside, no surge in power. She sat still, holding her breath. The light stopped blinking when her tears retreated and stayed steady all through the night. At first she thought it was coincidence. Maybe she hadn't noticed it before. But then it happened again and again, and always in those moments when she felt most fragile. The light pulsed when she felt forgotten. When she thought of her mother who no longer called, when she remembered the letter she never sent to the one person who once made her feel seen, when she looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The light trembled with her grief, softly, gently, never aggressively, almost as if it was comforting her, a silent companion of her sorrow. Sophia began to test it. On days she felt stronger, the light stayed steady. On days when she held everything in behind tired smiles, it blinked as if reminding her that her truth was still there, that her sadness hadn't gone unnoticed. Once she tried to speak to it, not aloud, but inside herself, thinking something like, "If you feel this too, blink now," and it did twice. She laughed out of disbelief, and something cracked open in her, a piece of wonder, a thought she hadn't allowed herself in years. What if the world really could feel her? What if she wasn't as alone as she believed? Weeks passed, and the flickering became something more than strange. It became sacred, a language, a signal, a connection to something she couldn't explain but could feel. She began to let the sadness speak instead of burying it. She cried without shame. She sat in silence without rushing to fill it. And every time the light above her blinked, she nodded back. Not afraid anymore, but grateful. Seen in some strange and silent way, she felt seen. One evening, something shifted. She had returned home from a particularly painful day where an offhand comment at work reopened an old wound, one she thought had healed. She entered her room, placed her keys gently on the dresser, and sat down. The ache was deep tonight, heavier than most. As she curled her knees to her chest, the light began to blink once, twice, then stayed off, just long enough for her to worry before it returned dimmer than usual. It flickered in a pattern, soft, irregular, like a heartbeat, but distant. Like someone trying to reach her, she whispered quietly, "I'm listening." She wasn't too sure why or to whom she spoke. But the light seemed to slow and pulse in response, a quiet rhythm like breath-like presence. In that moment, something opened in Sophia, not a door, not a revelation, but a quiet knowing the light wasn't broken, and neither was she. Her sadness wasn't shameful, it was sacred. It connected her to something beyond the walls of her room. Something kind and gentle, something that knew her ache and still stayed close. That light had become a mirror of her inner life, and somehow in watching it reflect her pain, she found strength. If you are this woman, if you've ever sat in silence waiting for the world to notice your pain, if you've ever felt like your sorrow went unseen, unnoticed, unspoken, perhaps this story is also yours. Maybe the universe has always been beside you in its own quiet ways, in flickering lights, in sudden wind, in the way a song plays when you need it most. Maybe all this time you were not invisible, just waiting for the light to answer. Sophia still lives in the same apartment, the same bookstore, the same quiet nights. But something is different now. She speaks more, smiles softer, pauses when the light flickers and says, "Thank you," even if she doesn't know who or what hears it. The light still blinks sometimes, but it no longer frightens her. It reassures her she is not alone, not anymore. Maybe today that light is yours. Maybe today the world is blinking with you, and maybe, just maybe, that tiny flicker is not a defect, but a sign that your existence matters. That your pain is not wasted, that you are still connected to something far greater than you know. If you felt something in this story, if a part of you whispered yes or me too, please consider sharing this space with us. My Vessel of Light is a place for hearts like yours, for women who feel deeply and love quietly and ache silently. You are welcome here, you are seen here, and you never needed permission to exist.